Hey, welcome to another episode of Thoughts of a Rambling Mind. This video today is going to be about white privilege. The reason why I'm doing this video, because it's just a generic topic, right? But I had a conversation with someone, African-American man, of course. He previously was on the police force, which maybe explains his thought process a little bit, but he said he does not believe in white privilege. And I was taken aback by that, right? And his reasoning first, I'll give you his reasoning first, right? Because it's very important. He didn't just make a statement that was uneducated or a statement that doesn't come from his own personal experiences or that kind of thing. So I don't want to disregard his statement and his reasoning. His reasoning for not believing in white privilege was that in every aspect of life, black men have and black women have the opportunity to advance. We have the opportunity to achieve whatever it is that we can achieve from what we are given and from what we're born with and what we're given by our parents. So in that sense, everyone in America has that same equality, all right? We can all achieve the fullest extent and more of what we have and what we are given, all of us. The privilege comes in, for me anyway, in what we have and what we are given. You know, where we start from, where the race begins is where the privilege comes in for me. All right, for example, white privilege is the ability to survive in life without having to think about the things that the masses, the average person, has to think about in order to survive. All right? Simple things. I mean, let's take the obvious from a police pulling you over. When the police pulls over a black person, there's a certain level of fear and anxiety that's involved in that with every single stop. Every time a police light or a siren appears behind your car, there is a heightened level of anxiety and fear and a certain type of behavior that has to go along with that in order to, in our minds, make it out of that situation safely and to be treated fairly and justly in that situation. Right? And that's probably the most common evidence of white privilege versus the lack of black privilege or black equality. But I like to go into some instances that are a little bit deeper when it comes to white privilege. So let's speak about gentrification for a minute, right? What is gentrification? Gentrification is when white people move into poor neighborhoods, or when, sorry, I apologize for saying white, when people with finance move into poorer neighborhoods, affluent people moving into neighborhoods that are less affluent, fixing the neighborhood up, upgrading it, and then moving in more affluent people who can afford the new rates that this new neighborhood demands, right? So this is gentrification. But let's really let you understand that your neighborhood being gentrified is not white or rich people moving into your neighborhood. It's white or rich people moving back into your neighborhood. You see, gentrification is one of the end stages of white evacuation, right? Gentrification comes after evacuation. What I mean by that is that any neighborhood that is being gentrified is originally occupied by white people. And when black people began moving into these neighborhoods, they left for fear that the property value would decrease, violence, or just pure racism, not wanting to live around black people, right? So those people left those neighborhoods. They went elsewhere into the suburbs and built up the suburbs. And then when the property value got low enough in these black communities where they could come in and grab significant portions of the community and rebuild them at a significant discount, then gentrification begins. They come back into the neighborhoods, buy it up, fix it up, raise the prices of everything, and then usually the people who were there can no longer afford to live there and have to move out. Okay. So, why do I talk about that? I talk about that because we're going to go back to evacuation. We're going to stay focused on that because gentrification is what we're seeing now. We got to talk about what was happening before so that we can understand true white privilege. Because in evacuation, right, what would happen was black people were isolated to certain areas in different cities across America. Black neighborhoods, impoverished neighborhoods, basically. They were isolated to those areas, right? The first thing that began the movement of black people into areas where they weren't previously was the integration of the school systems, right? So prior to the integration of the school systems, the entire system of America was segregation. There was no mixing, right? Now, when it became necessary to integrate the school system because the education that minorities were getting were far less than those that the Caucasians were getting, black children began getting bused from their neighborhoods into schools and into white schools in predominantly white neighborhoods. Again, what happened next is the precursor to white privilege as we know it today. What happened next is white people began to either A, remove their children from schools, or B, move out of that community entirely. So what began happening was the Caucasians that were a little more affluent, that lived in the areas that were within cities, and their children were going to white schools, predominantly white schools within the cities. These people began to move to the suburbs, the outskirts. Now, these areas were heavily wooded, so they had to basically build a community out in the suburbs. And this is how most suburban areas were built. And the reason why most suburban areas were built is that they were building these communities outside, away from urban, which we all understand urban means minority in most cases. Outside of the urban areas, creating a suburban area. And they also built schools in these areas, right? Because prior to them living there, there were no schools in these areas. They built the schools in order for their children to go to schools that are all white and not allowing the mixing. It's very important to know that because these schools, because the law was such that you couldn't tell someone that they couldn't go to the school because of the color of their skin, they began creating new forms of limits to admission, right? And you guys are probably familiar with these limits, these racist limits to admission to this day, right? So the first limit to admission was, of course, what they always use against minorities, price, right? They began to price the schools in such a way that the average African American could not afford for their children to attend. The second way is location, They began zoning schools. See, prior to this, there was no zoning of schools, right? You could go to school wherever it is that your parents wanted you to go. Once segregation fell, you were allowed to go to schools anywhere. But even before segregation fell, you as a black person were allowed to go to any other black school that you were allowed, and a white person go to any white school that they wanted to. It was merely up to the means of the parents to be able to have the child travel or not travel, depending on, to determine what school they would go to. But after segregation, they began zoning, where it became a mandatory thing that you go to a school in the area where you live. In addition to price and zoning, they created educational barriers, achievement barriers to enter the school, meaning that you had to have a certain grade point average or pass certain tests in order to attend these schools. Now, in the modern world, all of these things seem completely fair and completely reasonable. Like for you to say to someone in 2021 that you cannot go to this school unless you pass this test and get a score of this number because this school demands the best of the best, that doesn't seem far-fetched. But imagine living in a time where an entire group of people were inhibited from educating themselves, where it was law that these people were not allowed to learn to read, write, or do math, right? And then when their children are ready to join the school system, you say to those children that unless you have a certain grade point average in certain subjects, then you will not be allowed to come to school unless you can pass this test that tests you on these subjects with a certain grade point average, then you will not be allowed in the school. You're setting them up for complete failure because there's no way that these people who you told that it was illegal to educate yourself, there's no way that their offspring would now be educated. This is an impossibility, right? Why are we talking about this? And we're talking about this because white privilege is not just a thing that emanates in 2021, and it's not something that we can end because most people don't realize, especially white people, don't realize that they're privileged. Or if they do realize that they're privileged, they don't realize the extent of their privilege and how deep the ingrainment and the pursuit for white privilege and the persistence and continuation of white privilege is in America. So I will say that if you have a legacy and a lineage being more important, if you have a lineage, meaning generation after generation after generation, your family has gone to these schools with these barriers for entry, then you have white privilege. Another example of white privilege. If in 2021 you are a white woman and you come from a lineage of women who have no idea how to take care of their child, of their home, and of their husband, or maybe not their husband, but the child in their home for sure. If you come from a lineage of women who don't have an idea of how to manage a household or take care of their child, and they have a nurse, a nanny, a cleaner, anything of that, if you have a lineage of this, not somebody who just got some money and decided that they was going to get a housekeeper and a nanny. No, I'm talking about people that were born and they were raised with nannies and cleaners, and that when they grew up and they had children, they continued the process with their children. If you come from a lineage of women who don't know how to raise their children, you suffer from white privilege. Okay? What we don't understand as a people, as a culture in America, is that privilege is not just a visible or physical asset that allows you to promote at a faster rate. You know, privilege is not just what you get. Privilege is also what you don't get. Privilege is not what you have. Privilege is also what someone else doesn't have. Privilege is the ability to be oblivious, right? If you have the ability to be oblivious to a human being shot down in the street by a person who was sworn to protect, serve, and obey the laws of the land, if you can be oblivious to that, it's because your privilege has allowed that. It's a privilege to see certain amounts of deaths and destruction and not be affected by it. It's a privilege, and it's a privilege that can only be gained through the racism that this country indoctrinates us all with. How can you not accept that you're a privileged human being if you don't know anything about raising your children? And when I say raising, I don't mean teaching them right or wrong or teaching them how to tie their shoelaces. I mean understanding how to feed, bathe, change pamper, the necessities for your child to survive. If you're not familiar on how to do these things, how can you possibly consider yourself not privileged? If generations and generations of your family are women that have no idea on how to raise a child or keep a home, then how could y'all have made it that far without privilege? I was talking to a 70-year-old man from Montgomery, Alabama. And as he was talking to me, a number of tears welled up in my eyes. And I'm at work, right? And so I'm a real tough guy. I got a lot of pride. And as he's speaking to me, these tears are welling up in my eyes. And I'm trying my best not to let them fall. Because, you know, it's not who I am to be crying, especially about nobody's damn story, you know. But when you hear someone who's experienced the things that we've read about, when you hear them describe it, you can't help but put yourself in that situation. And the sad thing is that if I were ever in that situation, I don't know that my family genetics would still be here today. Because I don't think I have the spirit to take the abuse that these people suffered. I'll tell you the story he told me. He said he was maybe 4 or 5 years old. And he was in class. No, I would say 5, 6, or 7, because he said he was in elementary school. And he was in class, and he remembers tiptoeing to look out the window as people were marching from Selma, and black people marched right in front of his school from Selma. About 30 miles they had gotten from Selma to Montgomery, and they were going to keep on going. And he remembered looking out his window, seeing them coming, out the window of the school, seeing them coming. And in front of his school, a little further off, in the path of these marchers, were police riding on horses with batons, waiting. Firemen with hoses hooked up, waiting. And police officers walking with German shepherds, waiting. All of these people were waiting for the black people to arrive. And he said he stood looking out that window, so intrigued to see so many black people walking for a cause. And the crowd was throwing things at these marchers. And as the people who were marching got closer and closer to the school and closer to those that were waiting for them to arrive, the cops on the horses began riding out through the crowd and attacking the marchers with their batons, beating them down to the ground. And the firemen would open their hoses up on the black people. He said the force of the hose was so powerful, he would watch black people roll down the road under the force of the water. He said the police would let their German shepherds go and attack the black people. And he said he saw a black man go down on his knee and put his hands over his head to protect himself from the dog that was biting him, the water that was spraying him, and the policeman on horseback that was hitting him over the head with a baton. He said he saw him go down over his knees and protect his head. I couldn't help but drop a tear to think about an elementary school kid watching all of this and knowing that the reason why this was happening was because that man looked just like you. Knowing that the school protected you. The only thing that protected you from being a victim like that man was that you were behind this wall and this glass. Knowing that all of these people were being attacked, all because they had the same face that you did. What is white privilege? White privilege is not having people walking around in this country descended from atrocities. People walking around in this country today that have no thought of any hindrance to their path to their success. Well, it's not because of their race. It's not because of their sexuality. It's not even because of their gender, right? They have no fear or no second thoughts about the reason why they fail in life. Failing in life is something that builds character. Failing in life is a necessity in order to succeed. When you fail and you're not sure why you failed, then you cannot benefit from the failure. And unfortunately for black people, every failure or every time we fall short, we have to ask the question, is it because I was black? And once you ask that question, you now have taken the ability for you to truly learn from your mistakes away. Those are my thoughts on white privilege. There's a whole bunch more reasons why white people are privileged in America, and maybe I'll do another video at another time, but I really don't want to go into this topic because I'm honestly disgusted with the history of whites and blacks in America. I honestly feel like some of the worst things known to man have happened in this country. And so I'm going to end this video. I ask y'all to like, share, and subscribe. And I'm out. ThoughtsofaRamblingMind.